all people doing the history of Alberta labor. Our first speaker, I'll just announce all three speakers, and I'll be giving you each about 18 minutes. At 20 minutes, I'll absolutely cut you off because we'd like to have discussion. But our first speaker is David Bright, professor of history with the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Niagara College, and author of The Limits of Labor, Class Formation, and the Labor Movement in Calgary, 1883 to 1929. After David, we'll have Tom Langford, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Calgary and author of Alberta's daycare controversy from 1908 to 1929 and beyond, as well as editor of A World Apart, The Crow's Nest Communities of Alberta and British Columbia. And then Cindy Loch-Drake, who's a PhD candidate at the Department of History, York University in Toronto, doing a dissertation called Unpacking Alberta Beef, Class, Gender, and Culture in Edmonton Packing Houses During the Era of National Pattern Bargaining, 1947 to 1979. So we'll start with David. Thanks.
Thank you. This may, I may be in the wrong place to say this, but I spent 14 happy years in Calgary. Before I moved out to the evil empire in Ontario about a decade ago to teach history. I am truly delighted when Alvin Finkel asked me to come here today. It's wonderful to be back. Got the funny mic on. Following Betsy Jameson's advice, let me give you a little bit of my story. I left England for Calgary in the 1980s. This was the time the contrived war with Argentina over the Falkland Islands in 1982, which is now starting up again, it seems. The ill-fated miners' strike 2 years later, and the subsequent attack on unions in general. The Conservatives' willingness to tolerate post-war record levels of unemployment in order to keep inflation down. I was in my early 20s at the time, and I was despondent, dismayed, and disillusioned. And so, like generations before me, I packed up my bags and left to come to Canada, and I haven't looked back since. I arrived in Calgary in the summer of 1988 with a plan, and the plan was simple. It was to do a master's research project on the Calgary labor movement. I didn't know at the time that this had been done not once but twice already. But like I say, like most academics say, there was a necessary gap to fill in our knowledge. So rather than focus on institutions like the labor parties and unions, I said to my supervisor, I will look at real normal people and try and get a sense of their experience in Calgary. I did this firstly for a master's thesis which looked at the first 20 years of the 20th century, and I was reasonably happy with what I did. But I felt I'd been dumped into the middle of the story, because Calgary goes back before 1900, and obviously it goes after 1919, which is where I broke off. So, having had so much fun with the master's, I decided to do it all again with the PhD, but bigger and bolder. So I went back to the beginnings of Calgary in the 1870s and followed the story through to the Great Depression of the 1930s. This gave me basically 50 years or 3 generations of class experience to look at. That was the plan, anyway. Like most, if not all, labor historians, I was determined to marry theory on the one hand and facts or evidence on the other hand. And I had to demonstrate this in the work. I believed then, and I believe now, in class as a propulsive force in history. But the question is, which model of force do you choose? Which version of class do you pursue to demonstrate how and why history unfolds as it does? Given the time limits here, I'm not going to explain in great detail my model of class, but I did have one, and I was theoried up as I proposed my project. So there's my theory anyway. It was this complex model of class, but I knew what I was doing, or so I thought. On to the facts. One of the great things about doing labor history is you have the obvious sources to look at, the union records, government records, newspapers. But beyond that, there's virtually nothing which you cannot make use of if you're doing labor history. Personal papers, church records, police reports, charitable organizations, voluntary associations, and so on. And so I spent 4 years, 5 years maybe, I can't remember now even, a long time of my life I spent in the sources looking at the nature of class experience in Calgary in this period. And here's the problem. There is too much information almost. You've got to select some stuff. And that leads to the second problem then. You have this theory, and maybe you only pick those facts which suit your theory, and consciously or not ignore the inconvenient facts. Or maybe your theory is so excellent, like mine was, that it leads you only in certain directions and you ignore the other sources anyway because your theory is right as you know it. And then there's the what I call the Rumsfeld problem. Historians, labor historians included, are plagued by the problem of unknown unknowns. There are sources that I was unaware of, and probably am to this day, I don't know. But anyway, so you have theory on the one hand, facts on the other, and you have to sort of marry the two together. And early on, around about 1991 maybe, I had this great idea that one way to blend facts and theory together would be to go back to people who were actually alive at the time. People I could ask questions of to see if my theory did indeed match up with the facts that I had. So, thus was born the Working People of Calgary Oral History Project. The idea was to interview people who had grown up between World War I and World War II and ask them about their childhood experiences, their early teenage years during the interwar period. It seemed like a reasonable time period to focus on because the end of World War I was quite a momentous event, the beginning of World War II similarly so. People would be likely to remember these two events, the end of one war, the beginning of another war. So even 60, 70 years later, these would serve as good benchmarks, we believed. I should explain there were 3 of us doing this project. I managed to rope in 2 other people to raise funds and help me out with the hard work. They're not here today, sadly. Oh, they're here, but not here. There was a practical reason, of course, but simply we thought we couldn't go much beyond the beginning or the end of World War I. We weren't going to find people who were still alive, who could remember the pre-war years. I was actually wrong there. We did find one man who was born in 1902 and who enlisted in the First World War at the age of 14 in 1916. And I spent 3 to 4 hours with him, and it was not directly on the project itself, but it was one of the most interesting conversations I've ever had. So I had a plan, I had a focus, we had to come up with a method because we'd applied for a grant from the Alberta Foundation Resources, the Alberta Historical Resource Foundation, sorry, and they gave us money. We had to come up with a methodology. And this is our method of doing oral history. We came up with a questionnaire, some basic questions which each of the interviewees would be asked. Who are you? How old were you? Place of birth, your family background, what your father did, what your mother did, your position within the family, siblings, and so on. So we'd have a little sketch of each of the interviewees, and we could compare and contrast these across with the other ones. But the second part of the method was a bit less structured. In fact, it was not structured at all. It was simply to offer the chance to have a conversation with the interviewees, to say, well, now we have the basic information, tell us about what your experiences of the 1920s and 1930s were like. We wanted to leave it open-ended, so we weren't going to lead them in any particular direction. Again, the idea was the theory or my interests couldn't determine the answers. That was the idea anyway. We had about 50 interviewees in total, maybe a few more, split roughly 50-50 in terms of gender as well. We met them in their own homes. The idea of this was, firstly, they would feel, we hoped, more at ease, and more likely to open up about the past. And there were some very hard to tell stories they told us at times, and I think being in their homes, they found it easier. Secondly, though, being in their homes had the self-interested advantage of sometimes they would tell us a story and remember a document or a photograph or an artifact they had lying upstairs in the bedroom or down in the basement, and they'd break off, go downstairs, and come back and show us various things. And we were able to gather a number of artifacts, and with their permission, I hasten to add, pass them on to the Glenbow Museum for storage, and so they became part of Calgary's physical history. Interviews lasted about 2 hours, and I have to say now, just to get it on record, that every single interviewee was generous with their time, gracious in letting us into their homes, and to my surprise, maybe genuinely interested in the fact that we were interested in what they had to say. This is 20 years ago, and I'm still very happy with the way that the whole project went. I say that as not a believer in oral history at the time. I had some deep suspicions about the value of doing what I was doing. Why? For the same reason I find opinion polls highly suspect. We've all had this experience. You get a phone call and somebody asks you what you think about this, that, or the other. And the likely response is you will tell them something. And therefore you become part of an aggregate opinion on this subject or that subject. But it's quite possible that right up to the point of the phone ringing, I had no particular opinion on that subject whatsoever. It's, to borrow from quantum physics, and this is the first and last and only time I will ever do this, it's like Schrodinger's cat. Schrodinger's cat is both dead and alive at the same time until the quantum physicist observes the cat. I don't understand it either, but you go and check it. But again, I have ill-defined opinions on most subjects, and the problem is with oral history is that as you're asking questions, yes, people will respond and give you the answers, but maybe had you asked other questions, they give you other answers. And so we were concerned not to lead the interviewees too far. And so the one hard and fast rule that I came up with, and I imposed upon the other two interviewers, was this following. We were not allowed to use the word class, which was a problem because we wanted to know about class, but we needed to have them, the interviewees, broach the word if they were going to use it. Because I was thinking today earlier when we heard about the role of class consciousness, it tends to emerge at times of crisis. But is it there in the fabric of people's lives? If it is there, they can use the word. If they use the word, we could discuss it. But if they didn't use the word class, we'd carry on the interview and let it go. I'll come back to this idea in a second. What did it achieve? Let me just say this. If anybody's contemplating doing an oral history project, this is what it cannot do or what it should not do. It did not provide me build up the basic chronology of events of Calgary between 1883 and 1929. It didn't fill in any of the obvious gaps in the narrative. Why would it? 60 or 70 years later, people's memories were vague sometimes, they were muddled sometimes, they were plain wrong at times. They put people in the wrong decade, they got the sequence of important events back to front sometimes. You can get all that from the printed sources. So I wasn't looking to them to give me, the chronology of whatever. Similarly, people in my study who I was really interested in, say political leaders or labor union leaders, who feature prominently in the second half of the book anyway, didn't come to the mind or didn't come up in the recollections of any of the interviewees whatsoever. For them, as young Calgarians in the 1920s, 1930s, they didn't know which councillor was which or which MP was which. What they did do, and the title of this paper was Ambience and Ambivalence, what they did do was give me a sense of what it was like to grow up in Calgary during the 1920s and 1930s. I did go back. Here is the book itself, Limits of Labor, and Alvin was kind enough to give it a plug. He has to do that. I got my annual royalties statement the other day, and yet again, total sales zero. I looked through the notes and looked through the book, and the project itself hardly appears to be there. But like an iceberg, I know it's there because my understanding of the grit and the grain of life in Calgary largely came from these interviews. They gave me a sense of neighborhood. It was mentioned earlier, Gord mentioned being arrested in 4 quadrants of Calgary. Calgary is nice and easy to draw on a map as 4 quadrants, northeast, northwest, and so on. But it's lived in as neighborhoods, and neighborhoods are harder to define. But 50, 60, 70 years later, as I sat down with these men and women, they could tell me who lived next to who down various streets, what the limits of their neighborhoods were, what the next neighborhood was like 4 roads over, why it was a different neighborhood, stuff you don't get from the documents or evidence. People to avoid, that man down at number 47. Why? Well, just because. The curtain of history is being lifted aside, I found, and I was getting a chance to, again, get a sense of the ambience or the background buzz of life in Calgary in this period. Let me just give a couple of examples. What one lady told me, and I quote, "My mother, she'd make candy, and my brother, who works in the grocery store, would get small paper bags, and we'd fill the bags with candy. And then my older brother would go out in the neighborhood and sell them. And my mother did beautiful embroidery work and crocheting, and she used to make doilies and runners and everything. And my brother would take them and sell them." It was just a throwaway remark, but you suddenly got a sense of the dynamics of the family, that it wasn't just father, mother, and the kids doing other stuff. There was a family economy at play here. Sometimes things came into sharper focus. 1919, I won't give too many examples. 1919, the year of the Winnipeg strike, but also strikes across Canada. There was a strike in Calgary that year. I interviewed Reginald Parkin, who was the son of Robert Parkin, who was a trade union leader and a councillor or alderman, as it was back then, throughout the 1920s. He's a labor councillor. As a young boy, Reginald Parkin, the son, remembers his father telling him of the night in 1919 when the Mounties burst into their house at midnight in a midnight raid, and they were instructed to remove all subversive literature from the house. If you know the Mounties, you know sometimes the orders aren't that clear, maybe. And apparently the instructions were to take any book with a red cover, because red was radical and therefore it had to be taken. And Reg Parkin, the son, recalled his father laughing as they pulled a red leather-bound copy of the King James version of the Bible. And Robert Parkin says, "Take it away. It'll do you some good." So I got a sense of ambience. But also ambivalence, because again, and ambivalence was that even though everything they told us in these interviews indicated that they knew there was a social stratification in Calgary, that there were well-off people, not so well-off people, people who needed help, rarely did they use the word class. There was still a sense of community. And so I used the word ambivalence quite a lot in the book to try and capture the fact that it wasn't a black and white issue of class. It was a much more subtle, and I tried to address some of that in the study. And so what I got out of the project was again, the sense of ambience on the one hand, the sense of background, but also the fluid nature of class. And that did help me rethink my model towards the end. The favorite phrase. Let me offer the following concluding thoughts. I'm going to plug it again because the sales can't go down any lower. When the book was going through the peer review process, one of the readers who had, the mounds of paper to read, drew up a list of topics or ideas that my work had failed to consider. Fair enough, I told my editor, but then I offered in return my own list of topics and subjects that was even longer. And the point being is that the book was about what it was about. That's simple. Less fair, I felt, when the book was finally published. We get to the point. Less fair was the comments of one reviewer of the book who said that I'd drawn the wrong conclusions from some of the material. No, I thought to myself this time, I'd drawn different conclusions. And this, I want to argue, or would suggest at least, is at the heart of all historical inquiry, the contemplation of common sources from different points of view, reaching different conclusions, allowing for a variety of interpretations. And I'll say this honestly, if I were to do the same project again today, I have no idea if I'd approach it the same way. I have no idea if I'd reach the same conclusions. But it is with some sadness, when I was asked by Alvin to do this talk today, I went through the list of 50 names we'd interviewed, and I realize now that not one of them is likely still to be alive. And so my final thoughts is that while their lives and experiences and memories have truly become part of history, if you or anyone else is considering doing an oral history project or participating in one, just do it. If nothing else, future historians who will be denied the access you have now to those living sources may thank you one day. Thank you.
I'm going to build upon David's talk and talk about sources of information for my labor history research. Just to give you a bit of background, I'm not a historian, but I'm doing historical scholarship. And so in thinking about my project, I've come to the conclusion that my project's sort of defined by that fact that I'm not a very good labor researcher. The key features of my study sort of build upon my weaknesses, and in two ways. One is, I don't know how people like David can work on periods where the evidence is spotty, where you've got to work so hard to get the basic narrative put together, let alone fill in the holes in the sense of trying to understand what it was like for workers at a particular point in time to go through that. So one thing that I've done in my research is I've been working on a more contemporary period, and that's post-World War II workers' movement in the Crow's Nest Pass in southwestern Alberta, southeastern British Columbia. And the sources are rich. Every time I get back to the project, I say to myself, boy, there's so much here, and it's so rich. I don't have to work as hard as the real historians, and that's the way I like it. So that my project's sort of defined by that. And then the second area that I'm not a very good researcher in is I don't have the capacity, I guess, to work as fast as a regular labor historian, so that I've been working on this project for what it seems like forever. I think I started in 96 or 97, and I work on it for a while, and then I do something else, and then I come back to it, and I'm back to it now. I've got a 6-month leave where I'm going to be writing nonstop on this stuff. But think about it, from 97 to 2002, and it's not like an old project, it's a project I'm working on right now. So the 15 years, the slowness turns out to be one of the big pluses in the project. And the reason for it is, with people I've interviewed, with people I've talked to in the Crow's Nest Pass about my research, I've built up a relationship with them, a friendly relationship. So that it's not like a one-off interview I've done with people. I've hung out with them. And when you hang out with workers, they get to know you, the guard goes down, and you get a sense of what they are really thinking. Not, sometimes that if you're a skilled interviewer, that can come through in one interview, but certainly as the relationship deepens, you get different levels of people's understanding and experience. So the fact that I'm so slow and inefficient in my research in some ways has been one of the advantages of what I've done, because with some of my key informants, key interviewees, I mean, some of them have passed away, obviously, in the last 15 years, but the ones who are still around, it's like seeing an old friend, getting caught up, and deepening our relationship. So, those will be my two main points, I guess, for the talk in my research on the Crow's Nest Pass. One is, if you're doing labor research and you want it easy, you got to find topics that have got great sources, like what I've got with the Crow's Nest Pass post-World War II. And then secondly, with interviewing, if you can hang out with people, it gives you a different experience, a different understanding of workers' experience than if you just do the one-off interviews. Now, I read the labor history interviews that are on the web that ALHI has put up, and I know there's more to go up, and they're great. And they give me a different perspective on the things I'm studying. But I know that with my own interviews, if I go back to people 2-3 times over a 10-year period, that I get a different sort of understanding. And wherever you're doing that kind of research and you can build up continuous relationships with people, then it the people almost become like your co-investigators. You can put forward some ideas to them, some of your interpretations, and they'll tell you if it's wrong or if they think it's wrong or if you're off on the wrong track. And so it's that the participants become more than just people you interview. They become your co-conspirators, co-collaborators with the project. And they will eventually, of course, want to read your stuff in manuscript form. So it's great to have people in the know who want to really see what you're doing. Okay, so that's the overview. The pictures I'm projecting here are of the Crow's Nest Pass. And this is, many of you probably have been into the Bellevue mine tour. The first 300 meters or so of this mine is open as a tourist attraction. And this is the mine entrance that you go in there with the coal coming out. This is a more contemporary picture of the Crow's Nest Pass, but you wouldn't know it because the downtown was developed pre-World War II. And this is what it would have looked like World War II or even into the 50s, with one difference. If you look carefully here, you see that some of the storefronts are abandoned, that nothing's in there. Well, in the World War II period and right after World War II, the economy was strong. The demand for steam coal from the railways was still strong. So this would have been a downtown that was vibrant and the economy was good. That's Crow Mountain in the background. Okay, so I've told you, first thing is the sources are great. The documentary sources for my research on the Crow's Nest Pass, which allows me to establish chronology, allows me to understand the different dimensions of the workers' movement, include this. And before I talk about them, realize the problem I have. What I'm studying is not workers. I'm studying the worker movement in the Crow's Nest Pass. Now, we know that a worker movement is made up of individuals, but it's individuals working together collectively and building institutions, local unions, participation in the local council, and so on. So I'm not just interested in sources that give me details about individuals' lives and perspectives. I want sources that can let me know about collective activities, collective action, and then day-to-day democratic worker movement activities. So certainly standard sources are there. Local newspapers published weekly, even if they're anti-labor. The worker movement was strong enough, they'd use the letters to the editor page to correct mistakes and to put forward different points of view. So we've got that period of time post-World War II. The local newspapers were not all owned by the Sun chain or by some other chain. These are independent editorially. Other sources of information, RCMP security reports, they're there. They infiltrated the workers' movement from the 20s on, and so what they don't black out provides me some insight as well. There's very rich documentary record from both companies and unions, and that's pretty unusual. United Mine Workers District 18 was based in Calgary, and they've archived everything at the Glenbow. Some of the companies shut down completely when the mines closed in the late 50s and early 60s because the CPR had moved to diesel engines, and they weren't protective of the records anymore, so that we have, for example, the West Canadian collieries, their complete records, sort of uncensored, are in the Glenbow Museum. So, and there's other companies as well. Companies, union records. Now, local union records sometimes got destroyed. They would take the stuff to the dump and burn it rather than archive it. And so I have records of that where the memo from the local union secretary says, I took everything to the dump today. It's done. But there's enough there in the District 18 files, because local unions were sending copies to the district office, that you get a pretty good sense of what local unions were doing. Political parties had some records. The Labour Progressive Party, as the CP was called then, had their own little mimeographed newsletter. And so I've managed to capture some of those. RCMP had some in their files, and I got some other copies from the union record. So rich documentary sources. Lots of people have done interviews and put them, like David has done at the Glenbow. Warren Cargata, who wrote the first great book on Alberta's labor history, published, I think, in 1980, that Alvin and his team have built upon. All his interviews are in the Provincial Museum. Other people, and like, for example, he did an interview in 1978 with Art Roberts, who was a prominent mine worker leader, and asked a lot of great questions. I mean, if I'd been there, I would have asked a bunch of other questions too that I was interested in. But as I've said before, it's like you're in a coffee shop, you're by yourself, and all of a sudden you notice there's an interesting conversation happening at the next table, and you can't stop yourself from listening to it. And that's the way that a lot of these transcripts of interviews with key people are for me. That, yeah, if I can get in on the conversation and butt my way in and say, just a second, I'd like to ask this question. Well, you wouldn't do that in the coffee shop because that'd be rude, and you can't do it with an interview that happened almost 30 years ago or 40 years ago, but you can still get a lot out of it. So all of these sources allow me to build up an understanding of this worker movement, and particularly what I'm interested in looking at is what happened to this dynamic, militant, socialist workers movement when the economy collapsed in the Crow's Nest Pass, as the CP stopped buying coal, and the orders dropped by 75 or 80%, and mine after mine closed, and the area became a very locally depressed area. And so what kind of responses did this worker movement have? and what were the, how quickly and what were the effects on the worker movement when this local economic depression happened. And it's the combining of these two events or forces. The fact that we had a worker movement that had built what I'll call community socialism in the area, right up to World War II and then even up into the early 50s, when that community socialism was impacted by this severe economic downturn. And, you know, the kind of downturn is that young people just left the area. They had to get out of there. A lot of the people who were left were basically couldn't afford to leave because their house value had dropped from $4,000 or $5,000 down to $600 or $700, or they had workplace disabilities, black lung, or just this. If you work underground in coal mines, you get disabilities that limit your ability to do physical work after 45 or 50. So it's the coming together of those two things in the 50s and early 60s. And as you know, the economy of at least the BC side of the Crow's Nest Pass recovered because in 1968, a huge American multinational company, Kaiser Steel, invested millions of dollars into developing the first open pit mine on the BC side of the border. And so now we have this hugely profitable metallurgical coal industry in the Crow's Nest Pass. It's a different sort of an industry because there's no underground mining. It's open pit mining. I highly recommend that anybody who gets a chance to do one of the mine tours on the BC side in Elkford or Sparwood, they're open every summer, do it just to get a sense of what mountaintop mining's all about. But I'm interested in that period of time from the late 40s when we had this vibrant workers' movement, and then a period of 20, 25 years when things went down and that workers' movement was remade, recomposed in fundamental ways. Now, I think, have I got any more time? 3 more minutes, okay. So I talked about sources. I better finish my pictures here while I'm doing this. This is part of the workers' movement, which was literally destroyed in the downturn post-World War II. And in fact, this building, the Ukrainian Labor Temple, which was built in 27, was just taken down. It doesn't exist anymore. There were lots of buildings like that. And this is a famous picture that you've probably seen before, but this is from the high point of the workers' movement in the 1930s. And so it was this very socialist workers' movement which I was interested in seeing what happened to it as we moved 50s and 60s. Now, my final story has to do with my second theme, which was the theme of hanging out with workers and what you can learn from that. And because I've worked in the area for so long, I've gotten to know a few people. One of them was a longtime Crow's Nest resident called Grace Arbuckle Dvorak, who lived in the town of Coal Creek, which is near Fernie. Doesn't exist anymore. There's no mine and there's no houses there. And her family was all based in Fernie. Now, the kind of stuff that Grace did, I did a local history book, and Grace was one of the authors, so we got to know each other. When I went down to the Fernie area, she took me out to Coal Creek and described what the village was like. All you can see is foundations now. Have me over for lunch, talk about stuff. And there was one exchange between us, which always stuck in my mind. We were having lunch in her house, and I was asking her about Tom Uphill, one of the working class leaders. He was the Fernie and District Labour Party rep in the BC legislature for 40 consecutive years between 1920 and 1960. So I just asked her, Grace, was Tom Uppal a communist in your understanding? And she looked at me and she said, you know, I don't know if he was a communist, but he was definitely a red. And right away, I realized that there was a discourse about the left that she'd grown up with in the 30s and 40s, which she was able to draw upon in answering that question for me, which was a pretty sophisticated discourse. Because I'm an academic, and I just had the picture of her, you know, like she's an 85-year-old woman, she's really nice, and she's interested in stuff, but she's not really political. And then I realized that she was political. Now, Grace has passed away 2 or 3 years ago, and I keep on finding information about her, which I'll close on this. Grace had told me, well, my brother was a socialist, but I was never much into that. My husband wasn't a socialist. So I just took that at face value. But what I've since learned is that her maiden name was Arbuckle, and that was one of the leading communist families in Fernie in the 30s and 40s. And in fact, I picked this up because I was reading Warren Cargada's interview with Pat Lenihan about his work with the coal miners in the 30s and 40s. And he talked about how when he went to Fernie using an alias, because the RCMP was after him, that he'd stayed with the Arbuckles, who had since moved on to Vancouver. So Grace actually came out of this family with deep roots in this workers' movement, and I didn't even figure that out, you know, in the 12 years I knew her. I only figured it out later. So this is why sort of working with people and deepening your understanding helps you get into the material in a deeper way, and hopefully it will make my eventual book manuscript that much more interesting. Thank you.
I want to start in a similar way and say a little bit about myself. I mean, why am I doing Alberta labor history? I'm a Torontonian. I grew up in Toronto. I live in Toronto today. But I came out west to Alberta in 1980 and worked in the Syncrude mine office building. And I got a job as a file clerk there, having a 3-year BA where I had studied a lot of history. And after I'd been there for about 6 months, I tried to get a job writing for Syncrude. I thought maybe they could see me as a writer, and they couldn't. All they did was tell me that I needed to go back to school and take shorthand so that I could get a better file clerk kind of job. So that kind of is the origins of my interest in women's history and women in work, which is the area that I've really focused on. So I think I'll turn now to the ALHI interviews, which what I ended up doing for this presentation is focusing on these interviews that have been made available on the web and how I use them for my research on women and work in Alberta. And I'm going to use a couple of examples from my dissertation to illustrate some of the ways in which they really helped me and some of the limitations that they had. So I want to begin by emphasizing just how valuable I found these interviews, and that this is a really exceptional source for people doing labor history, especially someone like me who, although I came to Alberta in 1980, I left and I've gone back to Ontario and I've done my research from Ontario. So being able to access these interviews online from Toronto is really valuable. And also that they, this focus on working class identities is really valuable to me. I also want to acknowledge the effort and commitment that goes into doing oral histories. I mean, others have done them as well, and it takes a lot of time and commitment to find people who are willing to be interviewed, to conduct the interviews, to transcribe them, and then, as you're doing, posting them on the web. So for all of that, I just want to acknowledge the work and how valuable it is. Then other people come along. You've posted these interviews that have been created with a particular focus. And with the packing house interviews, the focus was on the 1986 strike. Well, my research looks at the period from 1947 to 1979. And so I was always looking at these interviews through sort of this dark period in Alberta's labor history and in the meatpacking industry, because these interviews were conducted after the Gaynor strike and after the plants shut down. So some people were really bitter about what had happened, and it colored their view of the earlier period that I was looking at. So that was one something that I had to factor into my own interpretations. So I come along and I'm looking at these interviews because I want to study gender. I'm really interested in women workers and also how gender affected the way, or how women and men used notions of masculinity and femininity to in their identity as packing workers, and how this might have affected who got elected as leaders in the union, and how it affected the ability of the packing worker community to get elected in electoral politics in the community. Those are the things that I was looking at. So I want to talk about Ethel Wilson. She was, well, I'm wondering, does anyone here know Ethel Wilson? Has anyone, Alvin Finkel's written about her, but nobody else here actually knows anything about her. Okay, so I'm going to begin by telling you a bit about her because she's pretty central to what I'm talking about today. So Ethel was a seamstress in the Burns plant who started there in 1937. She was deserted by her husband, had 3 young children, and got this job as a seamstress, and became very active in the United Packing House Workers during the war. And she became an organizer. She was vice president of her union local during the war, and became very involved in the union even outside of Edmonton. She ended up going in 1947 to an international convention of UPWA and heading up the women's committee for the union internationally. And she was also a strong advocate for women workers, of course, and in terms of equal pay and maternity leaves, those kinds of things. So when she was back in Edmonton, she was also involved in the labor movement. She was on the Alberta Labor Council, or the Edmonton Labor Council, and involved on she was Labor's representative on a committee that dealt with Unemployment Insurance Commission issues, and helped to get some women their jobs back when they got fired after the war because they got married. So quite an activist. So I found a paradox when I was looking at Ethel Wilson in the research and the records, because this woman left the labor movement by the early 1950s and entered electoral politics with a lot of support from the labor movement. And by 1959 had run for the social credit government. So I'm sure all of you know that the social credit government was a very anti-union government. And Ethel Wilson ended up becoming a cabinet minister. She was made the minister without portfolio in 1962. So she's this interesting figure because even the labor leaders that I saw transcripts of, and I also used the interviews done by Warren Cargata, and he interviewed Jack Hampson, who was the provincial staff rep in Alberta for United Packing House Workers. And I'm going to quote Jack Hampson, who seemed really bewildered by Ethel Wilson's decision to leave the labor movement and to enter electoral politics, and then to get involved with the social credit government. So he's quoted saying, "Then Ethel was to turn around and become a minister of that government, but I never could tie it all together." So this is a man being interviewed 30 years later in the 1970s, very confused about why she did this. So I wanted to understand better why she made this choice, and to understand the culture of the packing house, to understand the culture of the union hall, to better understand this. And I found textual clues to help me understand this, but I also needed to do oral interviews to understand better how packing workers saw themselves. So some of the textual clues were in the staff reports that Jack Hampson filed with the National Office, which I found in the Library and Archives Canada. And one of them said that in 1947, right before this major meatpacking strike, she was intimidated into withdrawing her name from a list of candidates to go to the National negotiations for this. They ended up striking for the national negotiations in Toronto. And it wasn't just her. There was the chief steward was also intimidated into withdrawing his name. So I wondered, you know, how assertive she was. And I found that she was no shrinking violet, because in during the 1947 strike, Ethel Wilson was given full credit by Jack Hampson in this interview done with Warren Carragata for standing up to Ernest Manning and his labor minister when they threatened to lay charges to put Jack Hampson in jail. Now, it was an illegal strike, and this would have really undermined support for the strike. And she's in this meeting, he gives her full credit for this, said to them, the government officials, that if they put Jack Hampson in jail, she would see that no hogs were slaughtered in the province. And she said, I'll guarantee that. And the government backed down. They didn't put him in jail. And it was a really successful strike. And it established the system of national pattern bargaining that was in place, I'm sure Jerry knows this, until the 1980s. So this was a system of pattern bargaining that really gave meatpacking workers a lot of leverage, a lot of economic leverage. And they were quite successful in making really good contract gains through the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And then things started to taper off. It was more difficult to make contract gains. Certainly, it was over by the 80s. So I was looking at the ALHI interviews for there's one more thing I wanted to mention about Wilson, and that is that 2 years after the 1947 incident, Jack Hampson says in a report to the national office, he says, Ethel Wilson feels that she was unjustly dealt with some 2 years ago, and being a woman, I guess she finds it very difficult to forget. So he's dismissing a grievance that she has about this incident that happened 2 years earlier. She's still talking about it in 1949, and it's completely dismissed by Jack Hampson. So I'm turning to the ALHI interviews, trying to understand the culture of the packing house. And one thing that I found really helpful was corroboration of a notion of masculinity. And I should mention that when I say gender, I'm not just talking about women workers, but I'm talking about, and I ended up doing a lot of research and thinking about masculinity as well. So how men saw themselves in the packing house. And I saw evidence of a lot of pride and sense of self-respect in their ability to withstand the really harsh conditions in the packing house. I mean, in the packing house, jobs were gendered. There was a gender division of labor, and men had the hardest jobs. They had the heaviest jobs, the ones that were in the most harsh conditions in terms of heat, hot and gore, and the most disturbing jobs. And I noticed in the interviews, a couple of interviews, the phrase "a special breed" coming up, and I found the same thing in an interview done by ALHI. So I'm going to just read the quote. It takes a special kind. This is a quote from my research, my own interview. It takes a special kind of person, because a lot of people used to come up to me and, "How could you do that? How could you eat meat after you do this?" So you have to be sort of a special breed to do that to begin with, I guess. And then I found in the ALHI interviews, Peter Holbein used the same phrase. I'm quoting him now, "Just so many people would quit. We've had people come in and start at 7 o'clock, and by coffee time at 8:30 or 9 o'clock, they'd disappear. You wouldn't see them again. The pace of the work. It takes a special breed to be a meat packer, it really does, because there's people that can't handle the kill floor situation. It's bloody and gory, and in the summer it's 190 degrees inside the kill floor when it's 80 degrees outside." So from this, I could see that packing men had a lot of pride in being able to be tough in dealing with these conditions. And when I was trying to understand who got elected and why they got elected, this was important to know, because this was what was valued in the packing house. This was what was valued in union leadership. And I found some external investigations of the leadership in Edmonton from the 40s and 50s and early 60s that was puzzling to me initially. And I'll just explain. There was one incident in 1949 where the leader of the Swift plant, his name was Stan Solomonson. Does anyone remember Stan Solomonson? No. he hit two other men at this union meeting. It was a citywide meeting of UPWA leaders, and he was upset because they were critical of him for the way he was running his local. And one of the men was Jack Hampson, and the other was Roy Jama, who ended up becoming president of the Alberta Federation of Labor. And what was interesting was the reaction to this incident, because the upper leaders of the union were critical of him because he had violated democratic processes in the union, and democratic processes were a really strongly held principle in the packing houses. And the upper level leaders were critical of him for that. And also because they felt that his behavior, being so aggressive, had tarnished the reputation of trade unionism in the city. And so that was the way they reacted. But the rank and file didn't have any problem with it, and they continued to elect him to a leadership position in their union. So he continued to be the president of the Swift Local for a number of years until he was eventually made a foreman. So from this external investigation, I could see two different ideas of what it was to be a trade unionist in Edmonton, in the Edmonton packing houses. One was you had to be more contained, more self-controlled, self-disciplined, and the other was it was good to be aggressive, and it was even okay if you were dictatorial or you weren't following democratic processes. These were values that were important because they were really useful in confrontations on the shop floor with management and really useful at the bargaining table. And so these were values that were important to workers. So when I was doing my interviews, I wanted to, I actually asked some people about incidents on the shop floor to see, I was seeing in the records evidence of incidents on the shop floor, rough kinds of behavior, and I wanted to, I asked people about this, and they would often dismiss or just say that it really wasn't very significant. It didn't happen very often. And I found in the ALHI interviews, there was a more openness about this, a more greater willingness to talk about this kind of thing. And the example that or at least about what these kinds of values and the way that leaders were viewed. So I wanted to give you an example from George Kozak's interview. He was a packing worker in the Swift plant. And I have a quote, I'll just read from this quote. "We had a president after that strike, talking about the 1947 strike, Jim Sesford. He's the one who started the whole thing. You had a complaint, he'd drop his knives in the vestibule there, and you'd think you're, down the steps, and he's in the superintendent's office. You so-and-so, what do you think you're doing? Fix everything up. He was such a thorn in their side that they created a department for him to go over and gather bones from all over the butcher shop and get him out. Then Solomonson came along. He was another one of us. Same thing. He'd caused them trouble." So I could really see in this excerpt, it helped me understand this, these investigations that happened and why the rank and file really respected somebody who could stand up to management. Those were important qualities in a leader in the packing house. So I'm trying to understand, why didn't Ethel Wilson make it as a union leader in this early period? And I don't think it's because she wasn't assertive. I think it was because she didn't fit the model of a trade union leader that was dominant at the time. It was a highly masculine model of trade union leadership, and that was one reason why she didn't make it. But also, she was an advocate of women's rights, and I think that was the other reason why she didn't get elected. And so, looking at the ALHI interviews, I found that there were very few interviews with women. There were a couple of interviews with women, and one of them wasn't actually posted on the website, the one with Mary Iwasu. I never was able to get hold of that interview, so I only had one who was one with a woman in the Edmonton packing houses. But I did my own interviews, but this suggested to me that this wasn't a high priority for ALHI. And the topic of leadership itself wasn't explored very directly. And when leadership came up, as it did, for example, with Donato Colangelo, one of the people who was interviewed on the website, he was critical of the 1984 union leadership to do with the lead up to the Gaynor strike. But there weren't any follow-up questions, or it wasn't opened up more. And so I felt that, yeah, leadership wasn't a high priority in creating these interview transcripts. But I did find one really telling comment. Peggy Morton was interviewed by ALHI, and she was in the packing houses very briefly. And I'm just going to read the quote that she gave me, to an ALHI interview. I had a short foray into the meatpacking industry where I got laid off on orders from above, without my foreman having any idea why I was being laid off. That was Canada Packers. It seemed to have been a mutual understanding between the union and the management that they'd be smart to get rid of me. I had 3 days to go before my probationary period was over, and I was silly enough to go to a labor school. Everyone was alerted that I was there, and Monday morning, I lost my job. So if a woman was assertive or advocating strongly for women's rights, it just seemed like those would be, it wasn't respected in the same way if it was a woman as it would have been, as it was in male workers. And finally, I just want to mention, I'm an outsider. So I'm from outside the province. I'm a woman. I'm not, I've never worked in a packing house, so I'm very much an outsider. And I think that limit, and also I don't live in the city of Edmonton. In fact, I haven't lived in the city of Edmonton. So that, I think in interviews makes it harder for people to be as open with me as they would be with someone who is from the labor movement in the ALHI interviews in talking about these kinds of issues which are more sensitive. So the ALHI interviews are really valuable for that, because some of these things came out in ways that I couldn't access. And just a little bit more about the. Okay, sure. Okay, so the last thing that I guess I want to mention about just a technical issue about the interviews is that the questions for the interviews aren't embedded in the transcript, so it makes it hard to follow the narrative, and I found it disjointed at times. And so that I wanted to offer a couple of suggestions about how the interviews maybe could be modified so they would be even more valuable to researchers. And I think including the questions that are actually posed, so it's a bit like Jeopardy sometimes, you're trying to figure out from what was said what the question might have been, and also to include a little bit of information about the person who's doing the interviews, because as I said, I'm an outsider, other people are insiders, but there's different positions that we all have, and so knowing a little bit about who did the interviews would be helpful as well. And I think, so I just wanted to conclude by saying, to congratulate the ALHI organizers of the Oral History Project and to thank them, because I think it is really quite valuable, and to say that I can see real strides have been made since I first accessed them in 2004. Now photographs are there, which really helps as well. And to thank you for inviting me to be part of the conference to help me think about oral interviews. Thank you.
Even though it's supposed to be on the break, I think we'll spend a little time with people's questions, because the break the next session doesn't start at 2:30, so maybe we can go to 12 minutes. In general, of course, all three speakers were addressing the questions. Doing oral history, interpreting its results, also reading gender into comments about other classifications of that sort. So, any comments or questions from you?
Thank you. I'm Linda Keeley. I'm from New Brunswick, and we have had a similar labor history project. My focus has been on female workers, women workers as well, a lifelong interest. I'm very surprised to hear what you have to say about the sparseness of the interviews with women. Am I correct? Well, maybe I should just ask somebody else to do it. It's not your fault. I'm just very surprised because I would have thought that gender and class and race ethnicity would be uppermost in the minds of the project, and that some kind of steps would have been taken to remedy that.
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. I think in recent years it has changed a bit. In the early years of ALHI, the focus was very much, I would say, on the trade union leaders interviewing, these guys who were in their 80s, before they croaked. And and so although, we would make lists and we would, try and get more women's names there, the truth is that, if you did an analysis of who the people were who were doing the interviews and who they were comfortable interviewing, there was a huge male bias. And I did a paper, in fact, on ALHI in its early years that I presented in Australia, where I saw this as a failure in the early years. I hope that's changed somewhat, but it sounds like in terms of the packing house, maybe not. But we do have, there are some from the Gainers period that are, just the Vicky Beauchamp one. Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Right. Okay. No, I think it's a valid criticism of our project up to a certain period and maybe to the present.
I also wondered why Ethel became a social credit person, since I don't think you quite got to that part of the story.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. Why did Ethel Wilson become a member of the Social Credit Party? And I think that she just saw that as the only place that she might get some traction on women's issues. The labor movement she just gave up on. And when you look at what she did when she was a cabinet minister, I mean, I know Alvin has said, it wasn't really that much that she was able to achieve, but given the context, it was all about, she set up a house for disabled children and a girls' parliament she established. She wanted girls to become educated in how to become politically involved, that kind of thing. But I think that she just saw that that was the best way to try and get some kind of traction on these issues.
Hi there, thank you very much for your very insightful presentations. I think each presentation touched on methodology, or I guess the process that you took to examine aspects of the labor movement. Lisa Tillman-Healy talks about friendship as method in her article, and I think she examines the benefits and implications of using friendship in terms of research. And I think, I guess I was just wondering if you can provide some insight as to how friendship came into play within your own research. Like, what was your relationships with the workers? And if possible, can you draw conclusions as to the importance of friendship or relationship building within the labor movement as a whole? To all the panelists, yeah.
Well, first off, I'm going to have to get that reference from you and read it. So that let's do that afterwards. Is it friendship? I mean, as a researcher, you often are faced with this ethical question: are you manipulating the people that you're working with because you need them to disclose and to feel comfortable with you and all that kind of thing? And I think, no matter what you think, you are manipulating to some extent. The thing about doing labor research is that if you have got common values and you are sort of part of the struggle together, then you can get beyond that sort of crassness and deepen the relationship. But still, you're using them in a way. But then, if they start using you, then that is where I think the relationship balances out. So that they're not using you to get publications or anything like that, but they're using you because you're a university person, and if their nephew needs some recommendation on what courses to study here or whatever. So, I mean, that's just off the top of my head, not an academic answer, but I do want to get that reference.
I think a lot of the women that I interviewed talked to me because sort of like a woman friend after a while, and they shared stuff that they would share with other women in their family. And that was wonderful from my perspective, but it's also an ethical issue because I found that you have to keep reminding people that what they're saying is public record, and that it's one thing to trust me, and it's another thing to remember who else they got to trust. And so one of the things that you have to do in these situations is make sure that they always have control of their own stories. You know, you give back the transcript, you remind people again that it's going out in the public, you let people delete what they don't want to be public, because that's part of what friendship's about as well, is you got to honor the trust.
Thanks. I hadn't intended to respond to this. I was interviewing people who are on average 50 to 55 years older than me, and our points of friendship were kind of limited at the time. There was one exception, again, Reginald Parkin, who was the son of Robert Parkin, who was the counselor I talked about. We did have many, many meetings, and he was never a friend, but we did remain in contact for quite a while, sorry.
Thanks. Well, I think given the time, we'll just thank our speakers again.